Do you really need to throw out your entire program to build a perfect peak and taper? Most lifters think so, but here's why they're dead wrong.
What?
People think designing peaks involves starting from scratch with hyper-specific programming, but here's the truth. Your best peak and taper is already hidden in your current training block.
Oh my God! Wow!
So here's the key to a successful peak and taper. Stop overhauling your whole program. Instead, take what's already been working and refine it for maximum competition readiness on the right day. So in this video, I will show you my exact principles and framework on how to transform your strength block into a successful peak and taper without throwing out your past off-season training. Now, if you're new here, my name is Norman Chung, and I've spent over a decade coaching powerlifters to compete internationally. So let's get into the real meat and potatoes of a peak and taper design. What do you actually need first? Well, you need a strength block that actually worked. Not just any program that you found online, but one that recently produced results for you or your athlete. And you need to plan ahead. I'm talking at least about 2 to 3 blocks in advance of your competition. So what considerations should you make when transforming that strength block? First, analyze the success of your training block. Was it actually successful? If yes, then that's your foundation. If not, you need to determine why. Things that you may want to ask is, were you slightly undertrained? Were you overtrained? Did you get injured? The key is looking back to when your training was last successful and identifying how the training dose was different. In this instance, the key is comparing back to when your training was last successful and identifying how the training dose was different, or if the context of you or the athlete has changed since then. Now, if you're struggling with this, I have a program analyzer that you can download in the description box below. Next, you need to interpret your time to peak performance. So what's that? It's how long it takes for you to hit your peak performance through a training block. Now, this is individual and critical to get right. Then you want to profile the dose of each microcycle within that mesocycle. This is especially useful if you don't use a static RPE approach within a training block. And you want to think of your training dose like a bell curve. On this curve, you have several points. A detraining dose on the far left below the baseline, maintenance dose where the curve crosses the baseline, minimum effective dose, the smallest amount of training to produce some positive adaptation, your maximum adaptive dose, the optimal training stimulus, hypothetically, maximal recoverable dose, which is where you can just about recover back to baseline, and finally, an overreaching dose, which pushes you beyond your ability to recover from. Now, during your peak and taper, you want your dose to land between your minimum effective dose and maximum adaptive dose. This sweet spot, or range, maximizes performance whilst minimizing fatigue. So why profile your dose? Because it allows you to be able to predict performance responses when you manipulate training variables. Now, if you know your body responds to a specific dose, you can design your peak and taper with relatively more confidence. So how do you profile the training dose? So you want to look at the performance changes in subsequent weeks, particularly focusing on changes in estimated 1 rep max. Now in this scenario, the E1RM of your top sets or peak intensity sets is especially important here. You can see how different weekly training doses of each week affects your subsequent performance of the following weeks and track these changes over time. This is how you can spot performance progress and momentum. So then you need to ask yourself, is it going up, is it going sideways, or is it trending downwards? The next consideration is ensuring sufficient specificity. Now, you need enough exposure to competition-specific intensities and movements. And the key word here is enough. This means working with weights with at least 87 to 90% of your 1 rep max, or the equivalent to singles at RP 5 to 6 minimum. Now, without this specificity, you'll walk into competitions less prepared for heavy loads. At the same time, you will also feel like you're stabbing in the dark with your temp selection as well. You also need to consider the available duration for your peak and taper. Ideally, this should match previous successful peaks or be similar in length to your time to peak performance. So now let's get into designing of the actual peak and taper. First, set your mesocycle duration. Now, this should be at least 2 weeks, but no longer than your time to peak performance. Now, if this is longer, you may want to consider adding some maintenance dose microcycles as a bridge between your last strength block or development block right before the peak and taper. These maintenance dose microcycles may be similar to or slightly easier than your introductory weeks. Next, you want to determine if the peak intensity needs to increase. If your previous block already had heavy singles to triples, you may not necessarily need to change the top sets that much. If not, you will probably need to increase peak intensity while potentially managing the average back offset intensity to maintain a similar overall training dose. This massively depends on how much the peak intensity has increased. The risk of not balancing the back offset intensities is potentially training a little bit too hard in the peak and taper. And subsequently, this may lead to potentially higher levels of fatigue, which is what you probably don't want. Now, by maintaining the average intensity at similar levels, you'll reduce uncertainty of a different athlete response. So now you need to consider the progression strategy. This refers to how training doses changes across the weeks. Now consider both the duration of your peak and the fatigue state coming off from the last mesocycle. And so if you've run multiple strength blocks back to back and fitness and fatigue is consistent with previous blocks, start the first week of your peak similar to how you've started previous strength blocks. If you're coming off a little bit more fatigued, you may want to start off with a slightly lower training dose in week 1 of your peak. If you're less fatigued,
Who's ready? I'm ready. Who's ready? I'm ready.
don't necessarily start with higher levels of intensity, just stick with what's worked so we can manage the uncertainty and predictability. So let me share 3 examples. Example 1, if your peak and taper duration equals your time to peak, you can run the peak just like the first portion of your last training block, timing it so that peak performance coincides with competition day. The next example is if your peak duration is shorter than your time to peak, run it like the first portion of your last training block, but ensure that the peak intensity exposure is high enough for maximal readiness on competition day. Example 3, if your peak duration is longer than your time to peak, you'll need maintenance microcycles to bridge the gap between reaching your peak performance and competition day. So now let's talk about the taper strategy. Now, tapering means reducing training dose from one point to another for the purpose of eliminating excess fatigue. But the million-dollar question is, what should you taper? Volume, intensity, both, or neither? Now, with this specific strategy of peak and taper design, the overarching training dose doesn't actually need to taper much or even at all. However, depending on the athlete, there may be room to taper small elements of the program to feel competition level strong. However, depending on the athlete, there may be room to taper small elements of the program so that the athlete feels strong on competition day. For intensity, only taper peak intensity if it's excessively high and causing acute fatigue. Otherwise, maintain this level of exposure for specificity and maintain the average intensity. There can be room to taper the intensity of back offsets, but not below what the lifter has been exposed to in previous blocks or 2. Volume is typically a more potent variable to reduce. Now consider no volume tapers if your previous block was not that hard in the first place and actually really successful. And this is because you may end up increasing the risk of potentially detraining the athlete. You may also want to consider a mild volume taper if your previous block was successful but somewhat hard. Now, you can consider reducing non-prime mover accessories more aggressively than competition movements. These may include your back and bicep accessory work, for example. Finally, you also want to consider your primary days. If your previous blocks had SBD days on the same calendar day as your competition, maintain that schedule. But if your primary lift day doesn't align with the competition day, you may need some bridging sessions to maintain that training dose leading into the competition. These bridging sessions should have a training dose similar to your secondary or non-primary days, ensuring that you maintain primed but not fatigued for the competition day. So here's what all this means in practice. Your best peak and taper comes from understanding what worked in your training and making strategic adjustments, not from throwing everything out and starting afresh. Take what's worked, adjust the dose based on the individual response, and ensure sufficient specificity and time it properly relative to the competition. And that's the formula for a successful peak. If you want to learn more about optimizing your powerlifting programming, subscribe to this channel. And for powerlifters who are curious about getting started with coaching powerlifting, I offer mentorship services, so check out my website for further details in the description box below. Make sure you drop a comment below with your questions about peak and taper design, and I'll see you guys on the next video.